And all right, now we're good to go.
Okay, so welcome to Metasploit training. So we're going to focus on how to use the free version of Metasploit, also known as Metasploit Framework, which basically means the console version. So there's a paid version called Metasploit Pro. It does have a lot of nice features. It helps automate discovery, as well as provide you with GUI, helps make life a little bit easier. But we want to help you hack on the cheap, so we're going to teach you Metasploit Framework. And anyways, it's also useful to just learn how to do things manually, even if you end up automating them later in the Pro version. So Metasploit can be a little bit of challenge sometimes to install. So I'm going to recommend that you download a Kali Linux VM that comes with Metasploit already installed and all configured, and use that. So that's actually what we're going to be using today. If you just Google for Kali Linux, they have both VMware and VirtualBox VMs you can just download and automatically run. And I highly recommend doing that. So if you don't know what Metasploit is, it's basically a vulnerability exploitation framework. So it has a bunch of features that makes it really easy for developers to add in new exploits or vulnerabilities and exploit them and run specific payloads. So let me cover a few basic terms for Metasploit before we get started, so that as we talk about them, you can at least remember that you heard them before. So the first thing we're going to talk about is exploits. So this is basically code that gets run when you exploit the targeted vulnerability. Then Metasploit has payloads. That's the code that gets run after you successfully exploit the target. So it's basically what you want to do after you exploit it. For example, getting a reverse shell and a capability called Meterpreter. So Meterpreter is a very popular Metasploit payload that most typically provides you a reverse shell to the target and a bunch of other features that you can do once you have access to that shell. There are also additional modules called Auxiliaries that provide functionality such as testing if exploits work or are vulnerable, scanning, brute forcing if passwords, and more. So if you're using Kali Linux version of Metasploit, then PostgreSQL is already installed. That's the preferred backend database of Metasploit that we're going to need for what we're doing today and probably anything you do there. So if you're not using Kali, you need to make sure that the first thing you do is start up Postgres. And there's various ways to start it depending on what Linux or Windows distribution you have. So if you're running Metasploit for the first time, the most important thing to do is to run msfdb init. So it's Metasploit Framework db init. You have to run it as root. So I'm going to run it as sudo. The username and password for Kali Linux is Kali. So since it's already started, it's already configured, I didn't have to do that, but that's so important to do. I just wanted to run it to make sure you know. So to actually start up Metasploit, you're going to run msf console. I'm sorry, my keyboard is very loud. So this will take a second and it will start up the Metasploit Framework console. So you get a super cool ASCII image every time you start it up that varies. This lets us know what version of Metasploit we're running, 6.0.45, the development version, how many exploits, auxiliaries, payloads, encoders, and everything else you have. So what do we do now? So Metasploit is best used for exploiting known vulnerabilities and enabling you to make use of that exploit however you want. Completely automated scanning for vulnerabilities, it's not one of Metasploit Framework's, or at least the free version, strong suits, but we're going to get to that in a bit and do some actual scanning. But to start learning how to use it, we're going to bring you some details from a vulnerability we already suspect exists. So right now we have a host that's 192.168.1.220 that's running a web server on port 1245 with an exposed CGI script that we think might be vulnerable to shell shock. So if you want a quick primer on how we got that, the first thing we did is run Nmap. And I know that the Nmap training is tomorrow, so I'm just going to go over a few super basic things. So if we run Nmap with these parameters, the -T5 is a timeout of 5 seconds. The -A does some automated service detection, and the P is 1245. That will have it scan just port 1245. If we run that, it will give us a little bit more about what is running on port 1245 on that host. And this is how we know that it's vulnerable, or suspect it's vulnerable. So what it tells you is that there's something running there. It's running the HTTP, And it's running Apache HTTPD 2.2.15 for CentOS, which is kind of an ancient version of Apache. And so one of the most famous exploits, if you have a CGI bin script exposed, is shell shock. So if we suspected, okay, this might be vulnerable to shell shock, but to be able to run it, we're going to need access to a CGI script. Then what we can do is actually go to the website in our browser and go to a page that doesn't exist. And that confirms the version number. But if we just go to the main page and then view source and look around, it turns out that for some reason there is a footer that is a CGI script. So we have what we need to run shell shock. So we're going to jump back to Metasploit and start using it now. So first thing we want to do is search for a scanner to see if we can verify that it's vulnerable to shell shock. So there's a search command. I guess the first thing to mention is if you have no idea what to do, you can type help, and then it gives you a whole lot of commands that you can use to do. We're going to go over some of them here. So search is the first one that allows you to search all of the payloads and exploits to know what options are. So let's search for shell shock and scanner. See if there's a scanner for shell shock. Turns out there is. One of the auxiliaries is a scanner for it. It says looks for mod CGI bash environment variable injection scanner. So to use a module, we type use, and you can either type the number here or you can type the name. I prefer to type the name because like a standard Linux console, you can hit up later. And if you've done other searches, the number won't be relevant anymore. So now we've used this module. But the first thing we're going to do is that you have to set options for most modules to be able to use them. I believe almost all of them have at least one option, which is our host, which is the remote host to target, but some have others. So what we're going to do is type options, but it shows us all of the options for this module. And what we care most about are the ones that have a required yes, but don't have a default setting, as those are the ones we're going to have to set. So if we look right now, our host is set to yes, and it has no setting, as well as target URI has yes. So those are the two we're going to definitely need to fill in. So we know the remote host because we looked it up earlier to the 192.168.1.220. So we're going to set that to 192.168.1.220. We're going to need to set the target URI to the path to the CGI script that we can just copy and paste here. And the other thing we have to change that's already set is notice the default target port or recipient port is 80, but our server is running on 1245. So we need to set our port to 1245. Once we do that, you can run the scan. There are two ways to run it that they're basically a list of the same things. You can run, or you can type exploit, which is way more fun to run. So we're going to type exploit and run the scan and see if it's vulnerable. So this scan by default tries to run the ID command on the host. It looks like it successfully ran the ID command and exploited it and is running as user Apache, so that we know that the system is vulnerable to it. So now we're going to want to search for the actual module to do the exploit and run a targeted payload. So we can do search for shell shock and then Apache. Notice that here it shows the scanner and here it shows the actual exploit. So to load that module, we're going to type use. I'm going to use the shorthand here because it's 0 and just type use 0. It says there was no payload configured, but it defaulted to Meterpreter. So Meterpreter is the most famous and most useful payload of Metasploit that we talked a little bit about that we're going to use. It gives you a reverse TCP shell and a whole bunch of other options that we're going to show you how to use. So now that we have that, we're going to need to look at the options that we have to set. Again, we're going to have to set our host because that's set to yes and blank, as well as target URI. And then we're also going to need to fix the port again. So like a standard Linux shell, you can hit up, and I can go back and set the same parameters I set before. I can type options to make sure they got set. So there are none that are required that have no values. It defaulted set the listening host and listening port, so we're good to go. So we should be able to type exploit and see if this works. So it looks like it's sending the interpreter. It says the session's opened. So now I have a command line. I can type ls, and I can start to do things. So if you want to know what commands you can do with interpreter, there are a lot here. You can do standard file system commands like ls, cd. You can download files from directories. You can upload files. If you jump down to system commands, you can execute commands. You could upload another binary and execute it. You have networking commands you can use to look at the open network connections. You can even do things like list their webcams and take snapshots on the webcams, or you can start listening to the microphone, as well as play commands. And playing commands like "you've been hacked" is a popular one to use. So I can look around here. Notice I'm in var www.cgi bin. So I wanted to go back to the directory and go to the standard HTML directory. I can see the index.php. If you remember when we viewed the source, it looked like a login page. So let's just look at the file. It looks like they had a hard-coded username and a hard-coded password here. So now we just use that to get the creds for the website, which is pretty useful. So to exit the interpreter, you just type quit. So here's, I want to talk about some of the awesomeness of Metasploit here. So shell shock is actually one of the easiest vulnerabilities to exploit. If you just Google, shell shock exploitation, you can quickly find a command line that you can customize to run. So for example, I grabbed one here, and I copy and pasted it. What this is going to do is cat etc password on the host. So I can just run it. It takes almost no time to run, and it cats etc password to the host. So did I need Metasploit to just exploit it once I knew a little bit about it and Googled? The answer is no. But the power of Metasploit is when I did this manually, I'd have to replace this command every time to run as many different commands as I wanted. The best part about Metasploit is that Meterpreter is the built-in payload that lets me run as many commands as I want without having to re-exploit it. So, every time I run a command here, I'm re-exploiting the system. I'm sending that stuff over the wire, so it's more likely that somebody's going to see that and potentially patch the system and make it so I can't run it again. So that's a really nice part of Metasploit. But there must be a way to automate a little bit more. So there are ways to automate the commands we just ran. So you can create your own resource scripts, and they're commonly known as RCs. So if I wanted to create, let's see, exploit ss.rc, here are the commands we typed. First, we used the module. So if we look back to our search, we searched for shell shock Apache. And this is why it was beneficial to copy and paste the entire name. Notice we did a use 0. If I jump back up, I see that we used 0. So I couldn't copy and paste there. I had to rerun the search to grab it. So I wanted to use the entire module name. So I'll copy and paste this into our script to automate. I wanted to use that. We had to set the R host, the R port, and the target URI. So I have those saved already that I'm going to copy and paste in. And we have to actually run the exploit. So I'm going to give it the -J option that starts the exploitation as a background job. It means once the exploitation is complete and you have a session, the session will be maintained in the background. And this is super useful for a couple ways. If you're doing multiple exploits at once, you might end up with multiple sessions, and this will save them all. Or if you're targeting multiple systems at once, you can run all the exploits in tandem, and then pick which session you want to load later on. So if we want to save this, the exploit ss.rc, we should be able to then run that script via resource and then the name of the file. Since it's in the same directory I don't have to give it a path. Notice that it quickly opened the Meterpreter session, but I don't have the command line prompt. I just in the current system. So if I type session or sessions, it shows me that I have one open Meterpreter session, and it gives me a little information about that system. So I can jump into that session by typing sessions and then the ID, which is 2. And now I have my remote shell on the system. If I want to save that shell for later, I can hit background, which will send it back there. I can type sessions and see that the session is still there. Or I can jump into the session again and just hit quit to close the session. Now, when I run sessions, you see that there are no active sessions. Alternatively, you can run this resource script directly from the command line, which you can automate in other ways. So I type msf console. Notice it already saved what I had. The -q makes it quiet, and the R says run this resource script. If I hit enter, it will take a second to load Metasploit framework, and then it will automatically exploit and put the session in the background. So I can run sessions here and see that I have my session there. So I'm going to quit this interpreter, but it says that I have an active session, so it makes me force it to kill it. So that's the way to do it. So if you're curious about how you can make scripts more customizable by potentially passing in the target IP during runtime, the answer is you can't really pass resource scripts parameters directly. But you can work around it by embedding Ruby blocks in the script to process environment variables or files to pass in the single IPs or targets. So we wanted to look at the exploit SSRC. We get rid of the set rhost. We can add in a little bit of Ruby code. I can put it in the right spot. So what this does is it sets rhost based on the environment variable target. So if I wanted to export target and set it to 192.168.1.220, which is the target, I think it's, now I can run the Metasploit command, and it will pull in that target IP, load it into rhost, and automatically do the exploitation again. So there's also one other thing you can do. If you have multiple targets, you can change this Ruby code to enable you to exploit multiple hosts at once. So you can put in, I'll just put it in the wrong spot, but put in Ruby code that looks like this. It will loop through a file targets.txt and set rhost to as many of those as it has. So if I echo 192.168.1.220 to targets.txt, and then I were to run the script again, it would exploit it for as many hosts as there are lines in that file, which enables you to script more complicated things to specific hosts. So that required a lot of pre-known reconnaissance. So what if we're feeling really lazy? So there is an older capability called Autophone. So it's deprecated though for a couple reasons that I'll talk about while it runs, since it takes a little bit of time. Since it's deprecated, you have to download it separately. So we need to exit Metasploit and grab it that way. So we have to wget it. So I'm going to exit Metasploit. I'm going to wget, and this is the path to it. I already have it, so it got downloaded to a separate file. So the important thing is you have to copy it to the plugins directory so that Metasploit knows about it, and we can then load it into Metasploit. And the plugins directory is the directory that Kali loads it into is where I'm going to copy it to. But note that Linux and Windows distributions put it in different places. So you might have to do a find for the plugin directory to figure out the specific space that your distro stores it. So I'm going to copy it to that place. And now I can hop back into Metasploit. Okay. One command we didn't look at is there is a host command that keeps track of all the hosts you've scanned or targeted. What Autophone does is it scans all the hosts that you've looked at, and I want to have it scan a new host. So there's a command called workspace that kind of keeps the different variables and database information separate. So I'm going to add a workspace called Autophoning. And when you add a workspace, it by default puts you into that workspace. So now when I type host, it doesn't know about any host that I've searched in this system. For reference, if you are confused, if you aren't sure how to use a Metasploit command, you can usually run -h or --help that gives you a little bit more information about each specific command. So To do Autophone, it needs to know about open ports or vulnerabilities on the host. So the easiest way to do this is to run Nmap and have the results go into the database. And then I can run db Autophone that will pull the results from Nmap from the database and use that to automatically exploit the hosts. So no, we haven't learned a lot. Nmap training is tomorrow. So I'm just going to do a kind of a basic one with the same options I used before. If I copy it, I guess I'll just, hold on, I'll type it Nmap. -T5 sets a timeout of 5 seconds. The -A does the OS detection, version detection, a few other automated detections. I'm going to target a new host that I know about, .221. So this will do things like tell us what, if it's a Linux host, what kernel version it's running, what services are being offered on the open ports, and what versions of those services are. And it stores the results in the PostgreSQL database for us to do things with it later, which is why we had to make sure the Postgres database was run and it was initialized earlier. So it should take a little bit longer to run. So the important thing to know about Nmap is it doesn't scan every port by default. It was a very common misconception folks have. I found that out a lot of our CTFs. It scans a list of commonly open ports to kind of save time and not be as loud on the network. So it's going to find things like if FTP is running, a web server is running, those sort of standard ports. It's not going to default scan port 12359 just because it's not a standard server port. So that enables Nmap to run in a reasonable time frame, but it's important to know because folks may say, hey, these are all the ports that are open on the system. And if you run it with the default parameters, that's not all the open ports that's running on the system. That's all of just common ports that are open. So what Nmap has done is dump a lot of results to the screen. But the benefit of having run it with a DB Nmap is it stores things in the database. So we want to know, just what ports are open, what services are running, and what versions of the services do we have. We can run the services command. Notice that it has host as well as port, protocol name, and the version information if it can pull it. So now we can run db Autophone and have it target all of these ports. So I'm going to copy and paste the command line. My copy and paste skills are a little weak. I'm going to copy and paste the command line, run it, and while it runs, first I have to load the module. Since it's a separate module, load db Autophone, and paste it, and this will run it. So what this command does in order is the -T tells it to run modules, to show all the matching exploit modules. The P says to choose the modules to run based on the open ports that are discovered, that are shown with the service command here. Use a reverse connect shell, the -R, which basically an interpreter for any of the exploits. -E says launch exploits against all matched targets, which basically means brute force everything. And the Q says don't show us all the exploit module outputs, as most of them are going to fail and it would be super noisy. Let me tell you a little bit more about why Autophone is deprecated. So the first reason is Rapid7 really wants you to buy Metasploit Pro, which has a lot of the automation built in, but it also does it way better. So it's usually worth it if you don't want to have to create the automation yourself. The second way is that the logic is really weak on this. It basically matches any exploits against that open port and then just brute force tries all of the exploits against them. So you can imagine how noisy that's going to be. I mean, there are 1,530 exploits that it's going to try against those open ports. So if you're a sysadmin watching your system, you're going to see a ton of traffic coming to your system. So it's going to make it pretty obvious that something's happening. In addition, systems like SCADA ICS systems, that are normally very temperamental, it's very likely to cause crashes or bad behavior for this. But the benefit of this is it doesn't really require much reconnaissance or effort on your part. So it could be a Hail Mary if you're like, hey, I couldn't find a way in, I'm just going to try everything and see what happens. Or if you don't have time to spend investigating what's on the system or adding the additional parameters, like the target URI that was required for the shell shock vulnerability. And I'll give you a note that autophoning the box with shell shock doesn't work. And this is just one method you can try to see if you get something easy. Notice that it takes a little bit of time to run. So why that happens, we're going to talk about what it's targeting. So the first system that we ran the shell shock vulnerability on was a custom VM that we made. The one that we're searching now is the Metasploitable VM. So the Metasploit team has made a VM called Metasploitable that has a ton of default vulnerabilities in it to make learning and testing Metasploit really easy. So everything we're doing now into the rest of this training, you'll be able to recreate yourself if you download the Metasploitable VM. And it's not as easy to create a vulnerable VM as you might think. So Metasploitable VM is very useful for learning how to use Metasploit. It has a bunch of vulnerable services on it. I've actually run Autophone twice. One time I only got one successful exploit, and the second time I got 3 successful ones. So some of the exploits are a little temperamental and don't always work. So it'll be interesting to see how many it finds this time. So as I pointed out, even with all of those vulnerable systems, it only gets 1 to 3 reverse shells back, which isn't very many. But it's more than you would get if you didn't know what you were doing at all. So it is useful in that aspect. So while it works, I'm going to I'll talk about Sshploit. So Exploit DB is a famous website that stores a bunch of exploits for various systems and what versions of software are vulnerable to which exploits. So there's a command called Sshploit that you can use both in Metasploit or if you have Kali outside of Metasploit that will let you search software versions to see if there are any known vulnerabilities for it. So that's what we're going to use in a minute once we find things while this runs. So the benefit is while this runs, we should be able to run another version of Metasploit and do a little work. So we're not just sitting around waiting. Remember, we saved our stuff in a workspace. So I'm going to go to Workspace Autophoning to look at the results of the services. So this shows all the services that we found. So if we were going to target a specific service, look, so far it's found 2 sessions. So out of the over 1,000 exploits it threw, 2 of them successfully returned a reverse shell with interpreter. So the first thing I might look at is,
oh, sorry.
Sure.
I'm not sure if you can see the chat while you're presenting, but a person asked, do you mind talking about MSF Venom a bit or custom payloads?
Sure. The custom payloads are usually written in Ruby, although I think they've added Python and Go support. So I don't know a ton about Venom. But the cool thing about Metasploit is that you can create both custom exploits and custom payloads. As long as you work within the framework that Metasploit has defined, you can create your own payload to do whatever you want, which is a big benefit of using Metasploit versus trying to code your own vulnerability exploit and payload yourself. If you write to their API, it makes it really easy to add your own capabilities to the system without having to do all of the other work to get the exploit and payload to run.
Thank you.
Hopefully that worked. No problem. So it's almost done, but while it's working, I'm going to use Sshploit for VSFTPD, the version I have that's running, and say, hey, are there any known vulnerabilities with VSFTPD 2.3.4? So this says that there are, and one has a Metasploit payload. So let's type search for the same thing and see what the specific Metasploit payload is to be able to exploit that system. So notice that this time it ran against all of them. While it's still waiting for some to find, only 2 of them returned reverse shells. So all 3 times I've run DB Autophone on this, it's returned different amounts of vulnerabilities, or different amounts of sessions for successfully exploited vulnerabilities, just showing that some of them are still temperamental. yes, writing your own modules is more of an advanced session, which we're just showing you how to use the ones that are already written. But that is another nice part about the Metasploit framework, is that it's open source, and there's an avid community out there writing custom modules and things. So it makes it really easy to learn from it with all the documentation that's out there, to look at the actual code yourself, to add code if you want, or to get help from folks that know how to write modules and are able to do things to add capabilities to it, which is especially useful because you're talking about SCID, ICS, and airport type stuff. There may not be standard vulnerabilities for things. So being able to write your own and plug them in here and get all the other capabilities of Metasploit, is a pretty awesome feature. Apparently one module is taking a long time to time out. But once it's done, we should be able to see the sessions. Looks like there were 2. So we have 2 sessions that were successful. We go to sessions 1, should have our shell. We type ls and see that we have access to the system. So to exit this, I hit Control-C. That will abort the session. Look at sessions, there's 1 left. I can do things with it also, but I'm going to Control-C exit out of it. Okay, now that we've seen that we could get some with autos, let's see if there are some that we can find without using AutoDB pwn. So we're looking at services. We found that there is a module for the VSFTPD that's running on the system. So let's use that module. It says no payload configured, so it defaulted basically to a Unix interaction shell. Again, we have to check the options. So the only option we have to set is our host. So since we're going to be trying a bunch of different exploit targets for this host, there is a cheat to fix us from having to set the R host every module we load. Set G will set the global variable. So I'm going to set the global variable R host to the host we're going to target, so I don't have to set it every single module. So now that that's set, I should be able to type options, see that our host is set there. Let's try to export it and see if it works. So the backdoor service has been spawned. It found the shell. Open up command shell. So should be able to type ls, and I can look around the system and I can cat an etsy password if I want and do things useful. So that was a success. Okay, let's look for some other services. Okay, the Unreal IRCD is running, but it looks like the version didn't get saved, which it probably just didn't parse the Nmap output correctly. But there is a command called notes that saves more of the specific output from Nmap into the database. So if I look at the IRC server, I see that it did find the server, and it's 3.2.8.1. So if I want to look and try to see search exploit, like, hey, are there any vulnerabilities against Unreal IRCD 3.2.8.1? So I'm going to try just searching for that version number, and it found nothing. I can try deleting and searching for small versions and didn't find it. So let me try searching with a space in between Unreal and 3.2.8.1. Looks like there is a backdoor command execution that's Metasploitable. So if I search, see what the name of the Metasploit module is, type use to use that module. And I can type options to see what options need to be set. The only option that needed to be set was our host. Our port is correct. Since we set our host globally, we didn't have to set it every time. So we should be able to type exploit. It says the payload has not been selected. So the way to see what payloads, apparently this exploit didn't have a default payload option. So show payloads will show us the payloads. The reverse shell is the most common one to use because it gets us a shell and we can interact with the host. So I'm going to set that as the payload. I'm going to set payload to that. Okay. And I should be able to type exploit. It tells me I didn't set an option L host. So if I look at options, the payload has a specific options that it needs to set. So I need to set L host. So what L host is it's the listening host. So it's what's the IP of the current system I'm on. So I type IPA, I can see my current IP is 192.168.1.219. So I'm going to set lhost to that IP. Now I should be able to exploit Unreal IRCD and get a reverse shell. Okay, can I type ls and look around the host? And I can. I can also cat sc password. So success. So that exploit was correct. So I'm going to hit Control-C to exit and abort. Okay. So you know how I mentioned, let's look at services. I mentioned that Nmap doesn't scan all ports by default. I happen to know that there is something open on port 3632, but it's not found in the services. So I'm going to do an Nmap scan with the same parameters. I'm going to have it target port 3632. I'm going to load, and I'm going to run it with the db command to load the results from that in the database so that I can then target it. So it turns out that dist ccd is running on port 3632. So dist ccd is a protocol to kind of allow remote compiling of software, but it also kind of gives you complete access to the box. So let's see if there is a Metasploit module for dist ccd. There is. So I'm going to use that module. I'm going to type options again to see what options I need. It says the only option I need is rhost that's already set. So I should be able to type exploit. Again, payload wasn't set. So I'm going to show payloads. Set payload 5, since that's the same one we used last time. Type options, I'm going to need to set lhost again because I didn't set it globally. So I set lhost to the current host we have. Now I should be able to hit exploit. And successfully get a reverse shell that I can, ls cat etsy password and do things like that. Okay. There, I'm going to hit Control-C to abort that session. There's more to Metasploit than just doing these things. So there's also the opportunity to kind of brute force common passwords for services. So I'm going to exit real quick to clear the session. I'm going to hit SF console. Watch it load again. And I'm going to look. Remember, I'm going to jump back into our Autophone workspace. So if we were to look at services, we see that MySQL is running. So are there any vulnerabilities against MySQL 5.0.51? And there is, but it's only ranked good. So to brute force services, username and passwords, it's often the module has a login entry. So I'm going to try searching for MySQL login. So there is a scanner that's a MySQL login scanner. Let's try using the scanner and see if we can get any credentials, which will make it really easy to just connect in without having to actually exploit the system. So I hit use to use it. I want to look at the options. The only required option is rhost. So I'm going to set rhost to target host. And I could type run or exploit, but it seems much more fun to type exploit every time, even if I'm not actually exploiting the system. So it quickly worked. It found credentials. So there's a command called creds that saves any credentials you find via the scanning method. So it turns out that the login was just root with a blank password. So now we have the credentials. We could remotely log into the MySQL system and do whatever we wanted without even having to use Metasploit. So let's say these all worked pretty well. Let's see if there's another service running and try looking it up. So notice that Pro FTPD version 1.3.1 is running. So we wanted to search for Pro FTPD 1.3.1. We don't find anything. I do find some things for 1.3. Although if you look at the version numbers here, 1.2 to 1.3.0 doesn't seem to match. And then 1.3.2 RC3 is a higher version. So even though Metasploit doesn't have one specific, let's just try using a higher version one. So many times higher versions, vulnerabilities found in higher versions may also be present in lower versions. So we're going to try using this exploit. We're going to look at the options. Okay, we have to set our host correctly. The other thing we have to do is set our port. So the default port for FTP is 21, but if we look at services, ProFTPD is running on port 2121. So we have to make sure we set our ports to 2121, and then we should be able to try exploit. It says automatically detect the target. Since it didn't detect the right version, it said no matching target. If I go to options, I can see that the exploit target is 0. So let me look at the target options to see if I can force it to target the system. Oh, sorry, show targets. Okay. I think I loaded the wrong module. So there was a Linux version and a FreeBSD version. Since our target system is running Linux, we want to make sure that we load the correct module here. Sorry, it's not load, it's just use. Loading loads external plugins. Use is for modules. So now if we look at options, the L host is set correctly, but we need to set our host to the correct. We need to set our port to 2121, and then we want to show the targets. So let's set target to one of the options that's not automatic to force it to actually do the exploit. So it will. And it worked. So we have interpreter successfully running. So it's pretty neat that it didn't automatically think it could run, but when we gave it when we forced it to use a target, it did successfully exploit the system and get us a reverse shell. So one thing to know is that sometimes you need to force things and be a little more creative with your exploits to get them to work successfully. So does anybody have any questions after all of that so far?
Feel free to come off mute if you want to ask a question.
Okay, and then we can keep going a little bit. So look at services. There are a variety of services here. So let's just search for one of these that's running. So Postgres is running. It doesn't know the exact version, but let's search for Postgres 8.3. There are no vulnerabilities. Let's search for all Postgres vulnerabilities. Interesting, none of these are really version typed. There's some exploits, auxiliaries. There's a login utility. So as we mentioned, we tried to brute force the MySQL to get it to log in. Let's see if we can brute force a login for Postgres. Probably going to set our host again. I don't see any other required parameters that are missing. So you can see it brute forced a variety of common ones. And there was one that was successful. So if we type creds, we see that it did successfully log in as the user Postgres and the password. So it got added to our creds as well as showed us a login successful there. So now we have one more credential for this system. So let's look at another service that we might have here. So there is Apache 2.2.8, which again is a pretty old version of Apache. So let's search for HTTPD 2.2.8. There's one from 2.2. I don't know if Apache works better than HTTPD. It does. 2.2 did work. So there are a variety of different specific ones. None of these look that specific to this version. So we could just pick one and try and see if it works. So this requires PHP. PHP is usually running on a host. Let's try options. So this appears to target a Windows server. So the fact that we know the server is a Linux server means this is not a useful one for us to target. Oh, I guess it did say exploit Windows here, so that's how we knew. There's a WordPress, which I don't think is running. There's one for DOS. There's one for struts. And then there's an A tutor. So none of these look relevant. So it doesn't look like there's a good automated Apache vulnerability here. So let's look at one of the other services. See, the nice part about Metasploitable is there's plenty to do. So there's Open SSH. So let's search for Open SSH 4.7. Open SSH 4. There is a SSH username enumeration. So that's another scanner. So let's try using the scanner. Options. The only option set here is our host. So let's try exploit and see what it does. It looks like it wants us to populate a username or a username file to try. So let's set username to root and then try to exploit that. So confirm that the user root was found. So this basically looks like it lets us test if a username is valid on that SSH system. So let's test the username donkey and see if it is found. It was not found. So this is a way we could enumerate what the usernames are on the system or read it from a file. If you look at the options, it says you could take a user file that contains a list of usernames to test. So this could be a way to validate what users are logged into the system. So if we were to search for Open SSH, see what other things there are. You can install SSH as a post command. Looks like the only one they have built in that's useful for Linux is SSH username enumeration. Let's look at some other features of Metasploit. So you can type back anytime to unload the current module. You can type help, and they give you a variety of things you can do. So there are developer commands you can use, as well as a bunch of database commands. So we've used most of these. We used services to show you a list of all the services. Vulns is useful. So usually once you successfully get an exploit, it saves that in the vulnerabilities. So it keeps track of what you've exploited so that you can remember later and go back. So this is useful if you're targeting a large system and doing some automated things, if you wanted to know what was successfully working for you. The other thing we didn't really do is that in all of our hosts, we targeted a single host. So if I wanted to, while it won't work, let's let's try the SSH username enumeration for multiple hosts at once if we want to target more than one host. Sorry, use. So if we want to set our hosts, you can set it to a comma separated list. So let's target both of the hosts that we had earlier. Okay, let's set the username is set to donkey. Let's set username Apache and then exploit. Maybe I got the comma wrong.
Hi, Nicholas. I
Sure.
just wanted to give you a 3-minute warning. We will have to stop a little bit before the hour because of the next session.
Okay, no problem.
Thanks.
So if you set our host to multiple values, notice that it hits both of the hosts. It found Apache on only one of the systems. So now if I jump to creds, it saved Apache in the 220, but not the 221. So if you had like a network with a bunch of hosts running the same system or the same vulnerabilities, or you wanted to do scans, for example, does a user exist? Which host does it exist on? You can use our host to target multiple hosts at once to be able to see what's going on there, which is a pretty useful feature. Since we only have 2.5 minutes left, I'll take anybody's questions, and if not, end it here. Anybody have any questions about Metasploit?
I have 2 questions. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep.
First, and I may have missed it at the beginning. Sorry, I'm in the mobile office right now. So, is this going to be available, the recording? Because I'm driving, so I haven't been able to write down too many notes.
Yes, the recording will be available.
Okay.
Most likely on the CTF page that we have going.
Okay. And what was the name of the VM, the exploitable VM? Was it exploitable VM?
It's a Metasploitable.
Metasploitable VM. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
No problem.
And then it looks like
Any
some
other
other
questions?
people have some questions, but they're not sure how to articulate them just yet. They might want to review the recording. Is there a way that they could reach out to you too, Nicholas? Would you be available via LinkedIn or?
Sure, LinkedIn works.
Okay. Or anyone can reach out to Women in Cyber Critical Infrastructure and we can try and connect you or answer some of your questions if you have some more.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for your time and good luck for the hack at the airport. Hope Metasploit helps you get there.
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.